Hello. Today is St Gobnait's Day, patron saint of beekeepers, of which I'm one. So in her honour, I thought I'd take a look at bees as they appear in Lewis's work. And yes, they do feature. And I'll show you some of my bees at the end. Before we get to bees specifically, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis tells us how his early childhood in Belfast was generally happy, with the exception of certain recurrent nightmares, either involving ghosts or involving insects. And the ones with insects were infinitely worse. He says, and he was writing this in his mid-50s, "To this day, I would rather meet a ghost than a tarantula." Now, that's an interesting question for the comments. Would you rather meet a ghost or a tarantula? And he also tells how his Oxford friend Owen Barfield once said, "The trouble about insects is that they're like French locomotives. They have all the works on the outside." Well, I don't know what the difference between French and British locomotives would be, I'm sure. But Lewis goes on to say their angular limbs, their jerky movements, their dry metallic noises are either like machines coming to life or something alive becoming a machine, which just added to the horror. And as for the beehive, he felt it represented some of the things he dreaded for the human race, including the dominance of the collective. Because, of course, in a colony of bees, the individual bee is totally expendable for the survival of the whole, which is often thought of as a mega-organism. Now, Lewis and his brother used to spend time at their cousins down the road, and it was in their house, rummaging through their many books, that he came on this one called Ants, Bees and Wasps. And he tells how, because of that book later in his teens, he developed for a short time a genuinely scientific interest in insects. Other studies soon crowded it out, but while my entomological period lasted, my fear almost vanished. And he says in Surprised by Joy that there was a kind of duality to his experience during his school years. One aspect was what he called his outer life, which covered most of his studies, for example, and the other was a more intuitive inner life, his secret imaginative life, which covered, for example, the deep experiences of joy that Surprised by Joy mainly focuses on. It was a kind of left brain, right brain divide, you might say. He says himself, the two hemispheres of my brain were in the sharpest contrast. So that entomological period would belong to the outer materialist, intellectual life. But he brings bees into his imaginative work too. There's a passage in Surprised by Joy when Lewis is a teenager at school in Malvern in England, an experience he hated on the whole. But he speaks with fondness of the library, which became a refuge for him. Books, silence, leisure, the distant sound of bat and ball. He was not a fan of sports. Bees buzzing at the open windows, and freedom. This is what the library at Malvern College represented for him. So it's nice to see this passing reference to bees at the window as a positive association with a beloved library, his place of refuge. And all this reminds me of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which opens by telling us about the obnoxious bully Eustace Scrubb, Lucy and Edmund's cousin. And on the first page we're told he liked animals, especially beetles if they were dead and pinned on a card. He liked books if they were books of information and pictures of grain elevators, and so it goes on. And you'll remember that the first of Pauline Bain's illustrations for the story is this one of Eustace and his insects pinned on a card. Eustace is no doubt having his own entomological period. And for some chapters he lives in an extreme form of the materialist outer life. There he is on a Narnian ship, and all he wants is radio connectivity and deck chairs. Later in the book, there's a moment on the magician Coryacin's island when Lucy's been set the rather daunting task of stealing up to the magician's library. And that morning she wakes up, and it was a lovely morning with bees buzzing in and out of her open window. It's quite an ironic contrast to how scared she's feeling. Although it's just a passing detail, it's good to see bees buzzing at the open window as a positive element in the description of the morning. And that's how it is in most of the bee references in Lewis, of course. There are bees in the new spring, when the witch's winter is destroyed in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And we see it through first of all, Edmund's ears and eyes, the rushing streams, the bird song, the fresh green leaves, the crocuses and the snowdrops, both good for pollen, I might add, and the bee that buzzed across their path. And later on the hill of the stone table, as Aslan and the witch have their conversation and everyone waits with bated breath, they noticed even small sounds like a bumblebee flying past. It's part of the lovely new spring which represents the overthrow of the witch's tyranny and her kingdom of darkness, and the new life that they'll now enjoy. In Prince Caspian, bees are part of the glory of the Narnia in hiding, when Caspian is first taken on a tour of it by good old truffle hunter the badger, meeting all the creatures of this magical place, who've been forced into hiding by the usurper, Miraz, another evil tyrant. And in a hidden wooded gorge in the mountains, Caspian meets the noble centaur Glenstorm, and there the open places near the river's edge were a mass of foxgloves and wild roses, and the air was buzzing with bees. It's a promise of freedom to come, a place of beauty and hope. Soon all Narnia will be like this again. Bees are usually part of the harmony and the goodness of nature when they appear in Lewis's fiction. And this goodness of nature is a pointer to a redeemed earth, ultimately, to heaven. There's a comedy episode in Prince Caspian when the prince meets the three bulgy bears who emerge somehow from an old oak tree, and they offer him some honey. And Caspian did not really want honey without bread at that time in the morning, but he thought it polite to accept. It took him a long time afterwards to get unsticky. And honey is part of the feast that Bacchus and the Maenads conjure up at the end of the story, when Miraz has been defeated and the good creatures of Narnia have been liberated. It's all part of the goodness of the natural world that so infuses the whole book. In his theological book, Reflections on the Psalms, there's a chapter called Sweeter Than Honey, which is a quotation from the Psalms. And in that chapter, he explores why anyone might think that the law of all things was sweeter than honey. When the wild song of Aslan created the animals back in the beginning in The Magician's Nephew, it says bees got to work on the flowers as if they hadn't a second to lose. And there's honey comedy in that book too, when the animals encounter the strange-looking Uncle Andrew with his wild mop of hair. "I still think it's a sort of tree," said the warthog. "If it's a tree," said the bear, "there might be a bee's nest in it." And later, the bear kindly gives Uncle Andrew a wild bee's nest he's found. Instead of eating it himself, which he would very much like to have done, this worthy creature brought it back to Uncle Andrew. But this was, in fact, the worst failure of all. The bear lobbed the whole sticky mass over the top of the enclosure, and unfortunately it hit Uncle Andrew slap in the face. Not all the bees were dead. The bear, who would not at all have minded being hit in the face by a honeycomb himself, couldn't understand why Uncle Andrew staggered back, slipped, and sat down. And it was sheer bad luck he sat down on a pile of thistles. And anyway, as the warthog said, quite a lot of honey has got into the creature's mouth. That's bound to have done it some good. And so that sort of Charlie Chaplin-type humour goes on at Uncle Andrew's expense. In That Hideous Strength, the last of the science fiction trilogy, the bear Mr. Bultitude is also very partial to his honey, and it's a weakness that gets him into trouble one day when he's escaped into the garden at the manor, and he starts to create all sorts of havoc with the vegetation. Now, the garden at the manor represents a kind of Eden in the story. It's a good place with many good associations. I'll go into that another time. And it's a walled garden. And crossing that wall, that boundary, that prohibition, is not a great idea. Let's read a paragraph. Now, in the early afternoon, that's Mr. Bultitude, the bear, had approached the garden wall. There was a chestnut tree within the wall, which the bear could easily climb, and from its branches he could drop down on the far side. He was standing, looking up at this tree. Perhaps he even hints here at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Mrs. Maggs would have described his state of mind by saying, "He knows perfectly well he's not allowed out of the garden." That was not how it appeared to Mr. Bultitude. He had no morals, but the director had given him certain inhibitions. A mysterious reluctance arose, a clouding of the emotional weather when the wall was too close. But mixed with this, there was an opposite impulse to get beyond that wall. He did not, of course, know why, and was incapable of even raising the question. Maybe a hint of the Tao, the universal moral sense that Lewis talks about in the abolition of man. Here in the animals too. If the pressure behind this impulse could be translated into human terms at all, it would appear as something more like a mythology than a thought. One met bees in the garden, but never found a beehive. The bees all went away over the wall, and to follow bees was the obvious thing to do. I think there was a sense in the bear's mind, one could hardly call it a picture, of endless green lands beyond the wall, and hives innumerable, and bees the size of sparrows, and waiting there, or else walking, trickling, oozing to meet one, something or someone stickier, sweeter, and more golden than honey itself. His sweet desire, forgive the pun, is another Lewis term for the longing, the yearning joy he often felt, but it leads the bear the wrong way. He does cross the wall, and as a result is captured and taken away to a very dark and evil place. But I won't spoil the ending. In Lewis's last novel, Till We Have Faces, based on the Greek myth of Cupid and Psyche, there's a terrible episode in the history of Glome when there are years of drought and bad harvests, and the river is like a corpse, we're told. It stinks. The fish are dead, the birds are dead, the cattle are dying, and in one stark sentence, the bees were dead. To stop all this, Orwell's sister Psyche has been offered up to the gods. And Orwell goes after her into the mountains, and the valley of the gods that she eventually comes to is fertile and full of life and beauty. I never saw greener turf. There was gorse in bloom, and wild vines, and many groves of flourishing trees, and plenty of bright water, pools, streams, and little cataracts. And when, after casting about a little to find where the slope would be easiest for the horse, we began descending, the air came up to us warmer and sweeter every minute. We were out of the wind now, and could hear ourselves speak. Soon we could hear the very chattering of the streams, and the sound of bees. There is water and bees in this place of life and wonder, and there across the river she finds Psyche, living abundantly. So, to finish, here are some of my bees, living abundantly, I hope. This was a sunny day at the end of January, so just about okay to take a quick look inside the hive to check they have enough stores, since I stole all their honey in the summer. This is a good sign, they're alive. Yes, plenty of baker's fondant left. No need to top up yet, though I'll have to keep an eye on it when they get properly busy. It's surprising to see them this active so early in the year. The air is cold, but they're making good use of the warmth of the sun. There are some snowdrops nearby, good for pollen to feed to the young. The queen will be laying now. The metal guards are to keep the mice out during the winter. So, happy St Gobnait's Day.